Have you ever been wounded so deeply by the people who should love you most that something inside you finally breaks? That moment when years of small hurts and dismissals suddenly crystallize into perfect clarity. My name is Alex Harrington, and for 28 years, I lived in the shadow of my father's disappointment. 28 years of being told I wasn't enough, of having my dreams dismissed as impractical fantasies, of watching my older siblings receive the approval that always seemed just beyond my reach. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Until the day my father, William Harrington, stood in his immaculate kitchen, the one I helped him renovate, during my college summers without pay, and called me nothing but a burden on this family, in front of everyone at my nephew's birthday party. All because I had asked for a small loan to help launch the tech startup I'd been developing for years. What my father never knew, what his pride and narrow vision prevented him from seeing, was that I wasn't just his disappointing youngest child. I was the person who would eventually save their family home, the home he was slowly losing to mounting debt while maintaining the facade of success. And after that day, I finally decided it was time to show him exactly who he'd been underestimating all these years. This is the story of how I went from being my father's greatest disappointment to the person who paid off the mortgage he was about to default on, and why I chose forgiveness instead of revenge when I finally held all the power. The Harrington family home sits on Maple Avenue in Westfield, Connecticut. A sprawling colonial with white columns and perfect landscaping that my father maintained with almost religious dedication. From the outside, it embodied everything William Harrington valued: stability, tradition, appearance. My father built his identity around being the successful regional manager of Hartford Financial Services, around hosting the company Christmas party in our pristine living room, around being the family that others in our upper-middle-class neighborhood measured themselves against. I was born Alex James Harrington, the youngest of 3 children, arriving 6 years after my sister Catherine and 8 years after my brother Michael. By the time I came along, my siblings had already established themselves in my father's carefully constructed narrative. Michael excelled in every sport he tried, eventually securing a baseball scholarship to Dartmouth. Catherine was the valedictorian, the perfect daughter who went on to medical school at Johns Hopkins. And then there was me, curious, creative, and constantly disappointing. My earliest memory of failing to meet my father's expectations came when I was 7. While other kids received praise for A grades, my A in math resulted in a week of mandatory study sessions in the dining room under my father's stern supervision. "Harringtons don't settle for less than excellence," he'd say, as if my 92% somehow threatened our family name. My mother, Elizabeth, was a gentler presence, though her attempts to shield me often resulted in whispered arguments behind closed doors. "He's just a child, William," she'd plead, to which my father would respond, "He's a Harrington, and he needs to understand what that means." What softened my childhood was my grandfather, Arthur Harrington. Unlike his son, Grandpa Arthur saw beyond grades and achievements. During weekend visits to his modest home in the next town over, he'd listen intently as I described my latest computer project, or showed him the website I'd built from scratch. "You've got the inventor's mind," he'd tell me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your great-grandfather had it too." Everyone thought his ideas were nonsense until he patented that manufacturing process that put your father through college. Grandpa Arthur had been an engineer before retirement, and in his garage workshop, he taught me how mechanical systems worked, the satisfaction of building something with my hands, and most importantly, the value of seeing problems as puzzles, waiting to be solved. When I was 12, he gave me my first real computer, not the family's shared desktop that was strictly for homework, but my own machine that I could take apart, rebuild, and program. My father called it a distraction. Grandpa Arthur called it an investment. By high school, the pattern was firmly established. Michael's trophies lined the mantel, Catherine's academic awards filled the built-in bookcase in the living room, and my coding competition certificates stayed in my bedroom drawer, brought out only when Grandpa Arthur visited. I learned to stop mentioning my accomplishments at dinner, tired of my father's dismissive, "That's nice, but when are you going to focus on something that matters?" What mattered to William Harrington was clear: prestigious colleges, lucrative careers, and maintaining appearances. What mattered to me, technology, innovation, solving real-world problems through creative applications, didn't register on his value scale. The divide widened when I chose to attend the state university instead of the Ivy League schools my siblings had attended. It wasn't for lack of options. I had been accepted to Cornell's computer science program, but the state university had just launched an entrepreneurial technology incubator that aligned perfectly with my goals. "You're throwing away your future for some computer club," my father had said when I made my decision, the disappointment in his voice so familiar it had almost lost its sting. Almost. What my father never bothered to learn was that the computer club became my lifeline. Under the mentorship of Professor James Chen, I developed my first commercially viable software application during sophomore year, a scheduling program that was eventually purchased by a local healthcare network. The modest sum I received went straight into my savings account, the beginning of what I privately called my Freedom Fund. College was also where I met Ellie Rodriguez, whose brilliant mind and quiet confidence drew me immediately. We bonded over late-night coding sessions and shared dreams of building technology that could make people's lives better. By senior year, we were inseparable, partners in both life and work, already sketching plans for the company we would someday build together. When graduation approached, my father made his expectations clear. It was time to get a real job, preferably in financial services where he could put in a good word. Instead, I accepted a position at a mid-sized tech firm in Boston, where Ellie had also been hired. My starting salary was respectable, but my father focused only on how it compared to what Michael had made in his first year at an investment bank. "I mean, at least it's steady employment," he'd conceded, in what passed for approval in our household. What he didn't know was that steady employment was just a stepping stone. For the next 5 years, Ellie and I lived modestly, pouring our extra income and every spare hour into developing Horizon Solutions, our vision for an integrated security platform that would protect small businesses from increasingly sophisticated cyber threats. We coded late into the night, conducted market research on weekends, and slowly built a working prototype that outperformed existing solutions in every test we ran. Meanwhile, life continued in the Harrington household. Michael married his college sweetheart Charlotte and gave my parents their first grandchild, a boy they named William after my father. Catherine completed her medical residency and joined a prestigious practice in Hartford, just a 30-minute drive from our family home. At holiday gatherings, the conversation revolved around Michael's promotions and Catherine's distinguished patience, while my parents' friends nodded approvingly. When asked about me, my father would say, "Alex is still doing his computer thing in Boston," with the same tone he might use to describe a temporary hobby. What none of them knew, what I didn't know myself until later, was that during these same years, my father's perfect facade was beginning to crack. Hartford Financial had been through several rounds of restructuring following the economic downturn. Though my father kept his position, his bonus structure changed dramatically. The first signs were subtle. My mother mentioned they were simplifying their annual vacation, the country club membership became a needless expense, home improvement projects were postponed indefinitely. I might never have discovered the extent of their financial trouble if not for Grandpa Arthur. During a private lunch when I visited Connecticut, he confided, "I'm worried about your parents, Alex. Your father's too proud to admit it, but I think they're struggling. The property taxes went up again, and that mortgage refinance they did for the kitchen renovation came with a terrible adjustable rate." I recalled the kitchen renovation, the summer project where I had served as unpaid labor while home from college, my father criticizing my measurement of the cabinet placements, even as I saved him thousands in installation costs. "How bad is it?" I asked. Grandpa Arthur sighed. "Your father won't tell me specifics, but I overheard your mother talking about possibly selling the house. You know what that place means to your father. It's not just a home, it's the physical proof of his success. Losing it would break something in him." I nodded, understanding completely. The family home wasn't just a structure. It was my father's monument, the embodiment of everything he had worked for and valued. Its loss would be a public admission of failure, something William Harrington had spent his entire life avoiding at all costs. By this time, Horizon Solutions was showing real promise. We had secured a small amount of seed funding and were preparing for a larger investment round. Our prototype had successfully protected 3 beta test companies from actual cyber attacks, generating case studies that demonstrated our platform's effectiveness. We needed one more push, additional capital to finalize the platform and bring it to market properly. That spring, my nephew's 5th birthday presented the perfect opportunity. The whole family would be gathered at my parents' home, including several family friends who had business connections. One in particular, Richard Whitman, had recently established an investment fund focused on cybersecurity startups, exactly the type of investor we needed. I arrived a day early, helping my mother prepare for the party while rehearsing my informal pitch for Richard. The house felt different, slightly less pristine, with small signs of deferred maintenance I hadn't noticed before. The formal dining room chairs need reupholstering, the hallway could use fresh paint, and the stainless steel refrigerator bore fingerprints my mother would never have tolerated in previous years. When my father returned from work, his greeting was the usual cursory acknowledgement before he launched into complaints about his new regional director. There were new lines around his eyes, his posture less demanding than I remembered. For the first time, I noticed how much he had aged. "How are things at the bank?" I asked carefully during dinner. "Fine," he replied curtly. "Business as usual." My mother's quick glance downward told me otherwise. The birthday party the next day was a smaller affair than the elaborate celebrations my parents had hosted for Michael's children in previous years. Still, the Harrington commitment to appearances held firm. Perfectly arranged food, decorations in my nephew's favorite superhero theme, and my father holding court with neighbors and colleagues as if nothing had changed. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Richard Whitman arrived with his wife and daughter, who was friends with my sister-in-law. After the cake had been served and the children were occupied with games in the backyard, I found my opportunity to speak with him privately. "Richard, I've been following your new investment fund with interest," I began, quickly outlining Horizon Solutions and our recent successes. To my delight, he was genuinely engaged, asking insightful questions about our security architecture and market positioning. "This sounds promising, Alex. We should set up a proper meeting. I'd like to see a demo of your platform," he said, handing me his business card. The warm glow of this professional validation lasted precisely 3 minutes and 42 seconds. That's how long it took for my father to notice our conversation, interrupt with an offer of drinks, and steer Richard toward more interesting company, with a dismissive comment about me, always talking shop about his computer hobby. I felt my face burn with familiar shame as Richard was led away, though he did manage to give me an apologetic glance over his shoulder. Standing alone by the dessert table, I made a decision. I would ask my father directly for a loan, not a handout, but a proper business loan with interest and repayment terms. It would be faster than waiting for the next round of investor meetings, and despite everything, a small part of me still hoped for my father's approval. I waited until the party was winding down. Most guests had departed, and only immediate family remained. We were in the kitchen, my mother and sister cleaning up while my father and brother discussed the upcoming baseball season. My nephew was playing with his new toys in the corner where I could see him from my position near the island counter. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'd like to speak with you about a business opportunity." He raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss me outright, which I took as an encouraging sign. "Ellie and I have developed a cybersecurity platform that's gaining serious attention," I explained, outlining our progress, the interest from Richard's fund, and our need for bridge financing to reach the next milestone. "I'm looking for a loan of $50,000. I can offer interest at prime plus 2%, with full repayment within 18 months. We already have commitments from beta clients that would cover—" "Stop," my father interrupted, setting down his coffee cup with a sharp click against the granite countertop. "Just stop, Alex." The kitchen fell silent. Michael and Catherine exchanged glances. My mother turned from the sink, dishcloth still in hand. "How many times are we going to do this?" my father continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone I'd heard throughout my childhood. "How many times are you going to chase these digital pipe dreams instead of establishing a proper career?" "This isn't a pipe dream," I countered, pulling out my phone to show him our client testimonials. "We have real traction, proven technology. What you have," he cut me off again, "is a fantasy that you're going to be the next Steve Jobs." Meanwhile, Michael has been made vice president, and Catherine's practice is expanding to a second location. "And you're still asking for handouts." "It's not a handout," I said, my voice tight. "It's a business loan with clear terms. I'm offering you an investment opportunity." My father laughed, a short, dismissive sound that hit me like a physical blow. "An investment opportunity? In what? Some software that will be obsolete in 6 months? If this idea of yours had any real value, you wouldn't need to ask your family for money. Real investors would be lining up." "They are," I insisted. "Richard Whitman's fund is interesting. We're in discussions with 2 other investors. This loan would just accelerate our timeline and increase our valuation for the— Heck, then wait for your so-called investors," he snapped. "Your mother and I have our own financial considerations." His voice dropped slightly on these last words, a flicker of something. Worry? Shame? Crossing his face before the familiar mask of disapproval returned. That momentary crack in his facade gave me courage. "Dad, I know things have been tight since the bank restructured. This could be good for all of us. Once Horizon launches fully, the return on investment will be—" "Enough!" My father's hand came down hard on the counter. "This is exactly the problem, Alex. You've always been like this, head in the clouds, thinking you know better than everyone else. Your brother and sister found practical paths, built stable lives. But you've been nothing but a burden on this family. Always needing special attention, always the exception, always wanting us to fund your latest scheme." The kitchen went completely still. Even my nephew stopped playing, looking up with wide eyes at the sudden tension. I stared at my father, feeling as though I was seeing him clearly for the first time, not as the intimidating figure of my childhood, but as a frightened man hiding behind anger and control. "William," my mother said softly, a warning in her tone. But my father wasn't finished. "We gave you every advantage, good schools, a stable home, connections, and what have you done with it? Wasted years on this startup fantasy while your siblings built something real. And now you have the nerve to ask me for money? Money you know we don't have to spare right now?" There it was, the admission of financial strain he would never have made deliberately. In his anger, a truth had slipped out. I should have felt vindicated by this confirmation of what Grandpa Arthur had told me. Instead, all I felt was a profound sadness, coupled with a sudden crystallizing clarity. For 28 years, I had been trying to earn the approval of someone fundamentally incapable of giving it. "I see," I said quietly. "Thank you for making your position clear." I gathered my jacket and keys, ignoring my mother's plea to stay. my sister's uncomfortable expression, and my brother's studied neutrality. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. You know, Dad, you've spent my entire life underestimating me. One day, you might regret that. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with a calmness I didn't know I possessed. Without waiting for a response, I walked out of my childhood home, something fundamental shifting inside me as the door closed behind me. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined as I drove back to Boston that night, hands tight, on the steering wheel, was that this painful rejection would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just my future, but my family's as well. The long shadow of my father's disapproval had finally lost its power over me, replaced by something stronger. The absolute determination to succeed, not to earn his approval, but to prove to myself what I had always been capable of. In that kitchen, when William Harrington called me a burden on the family, something inside me finally broke free. And in breaking, it cleared the way for what would come next. The fastest, most dramatic growth period of Horizon Solutions, culminating in a success beyond even my optimistic projections. A success that would, ironically, put me in a position to save the very man who had dismissed me throughout my life. But first, I had to return to Boston, to Ellie, and to the work that would ultimately change everything. The 3-hour drive back to Boston that night was a blur of highway lights and churning emotions. Rain started somewhere around Hartford, matching my mood as I replayed my father's words over and over. Nothing but a burden on this family. After 28 years of trying to earn his approval, I finally had absolute clarity. It was never going to happen. By the time I pulled into the parking garage of our apartment building in Cambridge, a strange calm had settled over me. I sat in my car for several minutes, the engine off, listening to the last raindrops hitting the roof. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free of my father's expectations, because I had finally accepted they were impossible to meet. When I walked into our apartment, Ellie was still awake despite the late hour, working on code at our dining table that doubled as a desk. One look at my face told her everything. "He said no," she stated, closing her laptop. "He said much more than no." I dropped my keys on the counter and recounted the entire scene in my parents' kitchen. Ellie listened without interrupting, her dark eyes growing increasingly indignant as I repeated my father's words. When I finished, she pushed her chair back and came to stand in front of me, taking both my hands in hers. "Alex, I've watched you try to win your father's approval for as long as I've known you. Maybe this is the universe telling you it's time to stop trying." "I think I already have," I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. "Something changed in me tonight, Ellie. It's like all these years I've been running a program with a fundamental error in the code, trying different workarounds instead of fixing the core problem." "And the core problem?" "The problem was thinking I needed his validation at all." I squeezed her hands. "We don't need his money. We don't need anyone's permission to succeed. We built something valuable, and we're going to prove it." Ellie smiled, that determined look. I loved coming into her eyes. "So what's our next move?" "We accelerate everything. We push harder on the investor meetings, tighten the platform's security protocols, and prepare for a full market launch in 6 months instead of 12. 6 months? Ellie raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious even for us." "We can do it," I insisted, feeling a new energy replacing my earlier exhaustion. "Starting tomorrow, we will go all in." That night, I sent one email before going to bed, not to my father, but to Richard Whitman. I apologized for the awkward interruption at the party and proposed a formal meeting to demonstrate our platform. His response came surprisingly quickly, just minutes later. "Alex, been thinking about what you shared. Very interesting. Can you come to my office Wednesday at 10 a.m.? Bring your technical co-founder and full demo." I showed Ellie the email with a grim satisfaction. This is just the beginning. The next morning, I called my grandfather. Arthur Harrington had always been my strongest supporter, and I needed his insight more than ever. I heard about what happened, he said before I could even explain. Your mother called me. Then you know Dad called me a burden on the family for asking for a loan. Grandpa Arthur sighed heavily. Your father's pride has always been his weakness, Alex, and right now, that pride is being tested in ways he never anticipated. What do you mean? The situation at the bank is worse than he's letting on. There have been more layoffs, and while your father kept his job, his compensation has been cut significantly. The house... He paused. They're 3 months behind on the mortgage payments. This was far worse than I had imagined. 3 months? That means they're at risk of foreclosure. Yes. Your father refinanced during the housing bubble, taking out equity to maintain their lifestyle even as his bonuses shrank. The new mortgage has an adjustable rate that recently jumped. He's underwater and sinking fast. I absorbed this information in silence. The proud, judgmental man who had dismissed my business acumen was losing his own financial battle and had been too proud to admit it, even when I'd offered a potential solution. Does Mom know how bad it is? I think she suspects, but your father has always handled the finances. You know how he is. Admitting financial trouble would be like admitting failure, and William Harrington doesn't fail. Except he was failing, and his stubborn pride was making it worse. Thank you for telling me, Grandpa, I said finally. I need to think about what this means. Just remember something, Alex, my grandfather said, his voice gentle but firm. Whatever you decide, do it for the right reasons. Revenge is a poor motivator for anything worthwhile. I promised to keep that in mind, though at that moment, part of me was indeed savoring the irony of the situation. The practical, financially responsible William Harrington was facing bankruptcy, while his burden of a son was on the verge of significant success. The meeting with Richard Whitman exceeded all our expectations. Ellie and I arrived at the offices of Whitman Ventures prepared for a standard investor pitch. Instead, we found Richard had assembled his entire technical team and 2 other potential investors. Your timing is impeccable, Richard explained as he ushered us into the conference room. We've been looking for innovative solutions in the small business security space, and what you described at the party, well, I did some research afterward. Your approach to predictive threat analysis is exactly what the market needs. For the next 2 hours, we demonstrated Horizon solutions, fielding increasingly detailed technical questions that Ellie handled with her usual brilliance. I focused on the business model, market positioning, and our phased growth strategy. By the time we concluded, the energy in the room was palpable. Richard walked us to the elevator himself. I need to discuss this with my partners, but I'm prepared to make you an offer by the end of the week. What you've built here is exceptional. In the elevator going down, Ellie and I maintained our professional composure. It wasn't until we reached the street that we allowed ourselves to celebrate, laughing, and hugging on the sidewalk like the overexcited startup founders we were. He's going to invest, Ellie said, her eyes bright with excitement. Did you see how their security director reacted when I showed the real-time threat neutralization? I saw, I confirmed, thinking about what this could mean for us. If Whitman comes in as lead investor, others will follow. This could be everything we've been working for. 3 days later, Richard called with his offer, $2 million for a 15% stake in Horizon Solutions, with additional funding available for our next development phase. It was more than we had hoped for, with better terms than we had anticipated. After consulting with our attorney, we accepted. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. With funding secured, we expanded our team, hiring 4 additional developers and a dedicated sales director. We moved from our shared workspace to a real office in a renovated factory building in Somerville. The platform development accelerated, with Ellie leading marathon coding sessions that often lasted well into the night. Throughout this period of intense growth, I maintained minimal contact with my family. My mother called several times, her voicemails carefully avoiding any mention of the confrontation with my father, instead focusing on trivial family news. I returned her calls, but kept the conversations brief and superficial. Catherine texted, occasionally, once mentioning that Dad seems stressed about work, which I took as her diplomatic way of acknowledging the financial situation. Michael remained silent, likely taking my father's side as he always had. My grandfather provided regular updates on the deteriorating situation at the family home. The mortgage was now 4 months in arrears, and the bank had sent formal notices threatening foreclosure. My father had listed the house with a realtor, hoping for a quick sale that would at least clear the debt. But the market was slow and the asking price unrealistic given the property's condition. He's still going to work every day, acting like, "Nothing's wrong," Grandpa Arthur reported. "But your mother says he's not sleeping, and he started having these moments where he just stares at nothing, like he's trying to solve an impossible equation in his head." I absorbed this information with complicated emotions. On one hand, there was a certain vindication in seeing my father face the consequences of his financial decisions, after years of judging my own. On the other hand, this was still the home I had grown up in, still my mother's security at stake. "Has he considered bankruptcy?" I asked. "You know your father," Grandpa Arthur replied. "He'd rather lose everything privately than admit failure publicly." 6 months after our confrontation in the kitchen, Horizon Solutions launched officially. Our platform immediately attracted attention in the tech press, with TechCrunch running a feature on our innovative approach to small business security. 3 regional banks signed contracts to offer our solution to their business clients, creating an immediate revenue stream that exceeded our projections. Richard Whitman hosted a launch party at his firm's headquarters, inviting key industry figures and potential clients. Standing on a small stage beside Ellie, champagne in hand, I looked out at the room full of people celebrating our success and felt a moment of pure clarity. This was what validation really looked like. Not my father's grudging approval, but the recognition of our peers, the satisfaction of bringing something valuable into the world. "I'd like to propose a toast," Richard announced, raising his glass, "to Alex Harrington and Ellie Rodriguez, whose vision and determination created not just a company, but a solution that will protect thousands of small businesses from increasingly sophisticated cyber threats. Horizon Solutions represents the best of what technology can do, make people's lives better and more secure." As applause filled the room, I caught Ellie's eye. We had done this, together, on our own terms, without compromising our vision. The moment was perfect except for one small detail. The people who should have been proudest of me weren't there to see it. That night, after the celebration, Ellie and I walked along the Charles River, talking about the future. The company was now valued at $16 million, making my share worth approximately $6 million on paper. Ellie's practical nature kept us focused on next steps, expanding our client base, developing additional security modules, and preparing for eventual Series B funding. But something else was forming in my mind. An idea that had been growing since I'd learned about my parents' mortgage situation. "I want to help them," I said finally, interrupting Ellie's thoughts on server expansion. She didn't need clarification on who "them" was. "Your parents?" "Yes. I know it sounds crazy after everything, but I can't just let them lose the house." Ellie was quiet for a moment as we walked. "It's not crazy, Alex. It's who you are. You've never been the kind of person who could watch someone suffer, even someone who hurt you." She squeezed my hand. "So what are you thinking? Alone?" I shook my head. No, my father would never accept a loan from me. His pride wouldn't allow it. Then what? I stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want to buy their mortgage from the bank." Ellie's eyes widened. Can you even do that? With enough money, yes. I've been researching it. The bank that holds their mortgage, First Connecticut, has a portfolio of troubled loans they're looking to offload. With Whitman's connections, I could approach them about purchasing specifically my parents' mortgage. And then what? You'd be their lender. Would you really foreclose on your own parents? If they still can't pay? No, I said, the plan becoming clearer as I spoke it aloud. Once I own the mortgage, I can set whatever terms I want, or forgive it entirely. Ellie studied my face in the lamplight. Alex, are you sure this is what you want? This would be a significant amount of money, and your father might see it as, I don't know, some kind of power play or humiliation. I'm not doing it to humiliate him, I insisted, though I had to acknowledge to myself that some small part of me did want my father to recognize the irony. I'm doing it because no matter what's happened between us, I don't want my parents to lose their home. My mother doesn't deserve that. And yes, neither does my father, despite everything. She nodded slowly. Then I support you. But let's be smart about this. We need to talk to a financial advisor and a lawyer who specializes in this kind of transaction. The process proved more complicated than I had initially imagined. First Connecticut wasn't interested in selling a single mortgage. They wanted to offload their entire portfolio of troubled loans. It took Richard Whitman's intervention and a premium price to convince them to make an exception. Additionally, the transaction had to be handled through a separate entity to maintain privacy and comply with banking regulations. I established Harrington Holdings LLC specifically for this purpose, working with a real estate attorney to navigate the legalities. The cost was significant, $675,000 to purchase a mortgage with a remaining balance of $540,000, reflecting both the premium I had to pay for the individual transaction and the accumulated late fees and penalties my father had incurred. 3. Weeks later, I received confirmation that Harrington Holdings LLC was now the legal holder of William and Elizabeth Harrington's mortgage on 47 Maple Avenue, Westfield, Connecticut. The bank had sent them formal notification of the transfer, though the name of the new mortgage holder wouldn't mean anything to them yet. That night, I called my grandfather. It's done, I told him. Are you going to tell them it was you? He asked. Not yet. I need to figure out exactly how to handle this. What I didn't say was that a part of me wanted my father to experience just briefly the fear and uncertainty that comes with having your financial future in someone else's hands. The same fear and uncertainty I had felt every time he had judged my choices and found them wanting. The next day, as CEO of Harrington Holdings LLC, I instructed my attorney to send a letter to my parents. It stated that the new mortgage holder was reviewing all recently acquired loans and would be making determinations about how to proceed with each property. In the meantime, no payments would be required for 30 days while the review was conducted. This would give my parents a temporary reprieve while I decided exactly how to reveal myself and what conditions, if any, I wanted to place on forgiving their debt. I told myself I was being strategic, giving them time to adjust to the new situation before I stepped in as their unexpected savior. But as Grandpa Arthur had warned, revenge, even the subtle kind, is a poor motivator for anything worthwhile. What I didn't anticipate was how this delay, this small taste of power over my father's fate, would affect not just him, but our entire family in ways I couldn't have foreseen. Meanwhile, Horizon Solutions continued its rapid growth. We signed 3 more major clients, expanding our reach beyond New England to the Mid-Atlantic region. TechCrunch named us one of their startups to watch, and a major industry conference invited me to deliver a keynote address on small business cybersecurity. Our team grew to 15 people, necessitating another office expansion. Success was everything I had imagined, and nothing like I had expected. The validation was real, but so was the pressure. Each new client meant more responsibility, more people counting on our platform to protect their livelihoods, I found myself working, longer hours, sometimes sleeping on the office couch rather than going home. Ellie noticed before I did. "You're pushing too hard," she said one night, finding me still at my desk at midnight. "This isn't just about proving your father wrong anymore, is it? It's about proving something to yourself." She was right, as usual. Beneath the satisfaction of our success, beneath even the complicated emotions around my parents' mortgage, was a deeper drive. To become someone who would never again be called a burden by anyone, for any reason. What I didn't realize was how this drive, this need to prove my worth beyond any doubt, was becoming its own kind of burden. One I had placed on myself. 2 weeks after purchasing my parents' mortgage, I received an unexpected call from my mother. It was unusual for her to call during business hours, and the tension in her voice immediately put me on alert. "Alex, I know we haven't talked much lately, but I need to ask you something," she began, her words carefully measured. "Have you heard of a company called Harrington Holdings?" My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't anticipated that she would make the connection so quickly. "Why do you ask?" I responded, trying to keep my voice neutral as I motioned for my assistant to close my office door. "We received a letter from them. They've purchased our mortgage from First Connecticut." Her voice quavered slightly. "It's just the name. I thought perhaps—" "Mom, I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back tonight?" I needed time to think, to decide whether to reveal the truth now or stick to my original timeline. "Of course," she said, disappointment evident in her tone. "I'm sorry to bother you at work." After we hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen, seeing nothing. The name I'd chosen for the LLC had been impulsive, a small gesture of reclaiming the Harrington legacy. I hadn't considered that my mother might recognize the significance, even if she couldn't know for certain it was me. When I called her back that evening, I had decided to maintain the charade a while longer. "About that company," I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "It's probably just a coincidence. Harrington isn't that uncommon a name." "That's what your father said," she sighed. "I thought maybe." "Well, it doesn't matter. The important thing is they've paused our payment requirements while they review the loan. It gives us a little breathing room to figure things out." "That's good," I said, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with my deception. "How's Dad handling all this?" A lengthy silence followed. "Not well, Alex. He's not sleeping, barely eating. The stress of potentially losing the house." She trailed off. "He's not the man you remember right now." I felt a twinge of guilt, quickly suppressed by the memory of his words that day in the kitchen. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do?" "Just, if you hear anything about this company, let us know." The uncertainty is the hardest part. The uncertainty I had deliberately engineered. My stomach tightened as I recognized the cruelty in what I was doing, not just to my father, but to my mother as well. "I will, Mom. I promise." 2 days later, I received a call from an unexpected source, my brother Michael. We hadn't spoken since the confrontation 7 months earlier, and his name on my caller ID was so surprising that I nearly let it go to voicemail. "Alex?" he said when I answered, his tone more serious than I could ever remember hearing from my typically confident older brother. "We need to talk about Dad." "What about him?" I asked cautiously. "He's had a heart attack." The world seemed to stop. Whatever complex game I had been playing with the mortgage, whatever vindication I had been seeking, none of it mattered in that moment. "How bad?" I managed to ask. "They're calling it moderate. He's stable now, but they're keeping him for observation. The doctors say it was likely stress-induced." Michael paused. "Mom thinks it's because of the house situation." A wave of shame washed over me. In my desire to teach my father a lesson, I had pushed him to a breaking point. "I'll be there tonight," I said, already pulling up flight information on my computer. "Good," Michael replied. "Despite everything, you should be here." The unspoken accusation hung in the air between us. This family crisis had happened while I was pursuing success and petty revenge hundreds of miles away. I arrived at Hartford Hospital just after 9 p.m., having caught the first available flight. My mother was sitting beside my father's bed, her hand resting on his as he slept. She looked up when I entered, surprise and relief washing over her tired face. "Alex," she whispered, standing to embrace me. "I didn't know you were coming." "Michael called me," I explained, looking past her to my father. William Harrington had always seemed larger than life, imposing even in repose. Now he appeared shrunken against the white hospital linens, his face pale, an oxygen tube beneath. His nose— "The doctors say he'll recover," my mother assured me, perhaps misreading my shocked expression. "But he needs to reduce his stress level significantly." She glanced back at her husband. "The house, the financial situation? It's been overwhelming for him for months." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. My clever plan to teach my father a lesson had nearly killed him. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," I began, but was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine and Michael. My sister hugged me tightly. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. Even Michael, always more reserved, clasped my shoulder in a gesture of familial solidarity. The conversation shifted to medical details, troponin levels, echocardiogram results, prescription medications. Catherine's medical knowledge was reassuring as she translated the doctor's findings into terms we could all understand. The crisis had momentarily bridged the divisions in our family, bringing us together in the sterile hospital room where our father fought to recover from a stress-induced heart attack that I had, in part, caused. When visiting hours ended, we gathered in the hospital cafeteria, the four of us together for the first time in nearly a year. "So," Michael began awkwardly, stirring his coffee, "Mom says your business is doing well." "It is," I confirmed, feeling suddenly self-conscious about my success in the face of my family's struggles. "We launched our security platform earlier, this year. The response has been better than we anticipated." Catherine smiled. "That's wonderful, Alex. Dad always said you were the creative one." I nearly choked on my tea. "Dad said that? About me?" She nodded. "He might not have understood your path, but he's mentioned more than once how you always saw things differently than the rest of us." Her expression grew serious. "Which makes what happened at Billy's birthday party all the more inexcusable," my mother finished firmly. "What your father said to you that day, calling you a burden, was cruel and untrue. The financial pressure had been building for months, but that's no excuse." I looked at their faces, my mother's weary concern, Catherine's empathy, even Michael's grudging respect, and realized how completely I had misjudged the situation. I had been so focused on proving my father wrong that I hadn't recognized how his failure had been reshaping our family dynamic all along. "There's something you all need to know," I said, taking a deep breath. "About Harrington Holdings." Their expressions shifted to confusion, except for my mother's. Her eyes widened with sudden understanding. "It's you, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "You bought our mortgage." I nodded, watching the shock register on my siblings' faces. "Why?" Michael demanded. "To hold it over Dad's head? To make him beg?" "No," I insisted, though the truth was more complicated than I wanted to admit. "I found out about the financial situation and wanted to help. But I knew Dad would never accept help directly from me, so you became his anonymous creditor instead," Catherine finished, her tone mixing disapproval with reluctant understanding. "I was going to forgive the debt," I explained. "That was always the plan. I just wanted—" I trailed off, unable to articulate exactly what I had wanted. Acknowledgement? Vindication? For my father to experience, just briefly, the powerlessness I had felt my entire life under his judgment? "You wanted him to know it was you," my mother said softly. you wanted him to recognize that his burden of a son had become his savior. Put that way, my plan sounded petty and cruel, especially now with my father lying in a hospital bed. I'll have the debt forgiven immediately, I promised. First thing tomorrow, and I'll cover any medical expenses not covered by insurance. Michael's expression hardened. So you'll be the big hero, swooping in to save the day after Dad's had a heart attack. Perfect timing, Alex. That's not fair, Catherine interjected. Alex didn't cause Dad's heart condition. But didn't I? The stress of potential foreclosure, amplified by the uncertainty I had deliberately created. I couldn't escape my role in my father's collapse. Michael's right, I admitted. I handled this all wrong. I struggled to find the words. I wanted Dad to see me differently, to acknowledge that I wasn't a burden or a failure, but I never wanted this. My mother reached across the table to take my hand. We know that, Alex, and your father needs to hear it too, when he's stronger. The following morning, I contacted my attorney from the hospital waiting room. By noon, the documents were being prepared to forgive the remaining mortgage balance on my parents' home. I instructed that the paperwork be expedited, with no mention of my personal connection to Harrington Holdings. When I returned to my father's room, he was awake, propped up against pillows and looking marginally better than the night before. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me. Alex, he said, his voice raspier than usual. You didn't have to come all this way. Of course I did, I replied, taking the chair beside his bed. How are you feeling? Like I've been hit by a truck, he admitted with a weak attempt at a smile. The doctors say I'm lucky. It could have been much worse. An uncomfortable silence settled between us. There was so much unsaid, so many years of misunderstanding and hurt on both sides. I had rehearsed a dozen different speeches on the flight, from Boston. But now, facing my vulnerable father, none of them seemed right. Dad, about the house. I began carefully. He raised a hand to stop me. I don't want to discuss that now. The doctor says I need to avoid stress. That's actually why I'm bringing it up. I think you'll find the situation has been resolved. He frowned, confusion evident in his pale features. What are you talking about? Before I could explain further, a nurse entered to check his vitals, effectively ending our conversation. Perhaps it was for the best. This wasn't the time or place for the full revelation. Better to let the paperwork speak for itself, to give him time to process the forgiveness of the debt before confronting the knowledge of who had orchestrated it. I stayed at the hospital for 3 days, working remotely when possible, taking shifts with my mother and siblings at my father's bedside. On the 4th day, as his condition improved enough for the doctors to discuss discharge plans, I received the confirmation I had been waiting for. The mortgage forgiveness had been processed and recorded. My parents now owned their home free and clear. That afternoon, as I sat with my father while my mother spoke with the discharge coordinator, he seemed unusually pensive. Your mother tells me your business is doing well, he said finally, breaking a lengthy silence. It is, I confirmed. We're expanding faster than projected. He nodded slowly. That security platform you were developing, the one you wanted the loan for, that worked out? Yes. We secured investor funding about a month after the conversation at Billy's birthday party. My father winced slightly. Whether from physical pain or the memory, I couldn't tell. I said things that day that were inexcusable, he said, surprising me. Calling you a burden. I was wrong, Alex. The financial pressure, the fear of losing everything I'd built, I lashed out at you because you represented a path I didn't understand. It was more self-awareness than I had ever heard from my father, and it left me momentarily speechless. Thank you for saying that, I managed finally. It means a lot. He shifted uncomfortably against his pillows. There's something strange happening with our mortgage, he said, changing the subject. Elizabeth received a call this morning from someone at Harrington Holdings. Apparently, our loan balance has been— He shook his head in disbelief. Forgiven! The entire remaining amount. They're saying we own the house outright now. I maintained a neutral expression with effort. That's unexpected. It's impossible, my father countered. Financial institutions don't just forgive $500,000 debts out of kindness. There must be some catch, some angle I'm not seeing. Maybe there isn't, I suggested. Maybe someone wanted to help. He studied my face, suspicion dawning in his eyes. Harrington Holdings, he said slowly. The name, it's not a coincidence, is it? I met his gaze steadily. No, Dad, it's not. The realization seemed to hit him physically. He sank back against his pillows, eyes wide with shock. You bought our mortgage? How could you possibly afford— He stopped, understanding transforming his expression. Your company. It's really that successful? Horizon Solutions is currently valued at just over $16 million, I said quietly. My stake is worth about $6 million on paper, enough to purchase your mortgage and have it forgiven. My father stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. The proud, judgmental man who had dismissed my business acumen was gone, replaced by someone trying to reconcile his perception of his youngest child with the reality before him. Why? He asked finally. After what I said to you, after how I've treated you, why would you do this? It was the question I had been asking myself since the moment I decided to purchase the mortgage. The answer had evolved from a desire for vindication to something more complex, and ultimately, more human. Because you're my father, I said simply. And despite everything, I didn't want you and Mom to lose your home. Tears filled his eyes, something I had seen only once before, at my grandfather's funeral. I don't deserve this, he whispered. Maybe not, I acknowledged. But Mom does, and frankly, I didn't do it for your gratitude. I did it because I could, because I'm not the burden you thought I was, and because it was the right thing to do. He reached for my hand then, his grip weak but desperate. I was wrong about you, Alex. So wrong. For so long. Can you ever forgive me? The question hung between us, weighted with decades of misunderstanding and hurt. The easy answer would have been yes, a simple forgiveness to match the financial debt I had forgiven. But the truth was more complicated, the wounds too deep for such a simple remedy. I don't know, I admitted. But I'm willing to try. Not because of what you did or didn't deserve, but because holding on to that anger was becoming its own kind of burden. A soft knock at the door interrupted us. The discharge coordinator had returned with my mother, bearing paperwork and instructions for my father's care at home. The moment for deeper reconciliation had passed, but something had shifted between us. A foundation laid for a new kind of relationship, should we choose to build on it. As they reviewed the discharge paperwork, my phone buzzed with a text from Ellie. Major security breach at Mid-South Bank. Their systems have been compromised. They're reaching out for emergency implementation of our platform. How soon can you get back? The timing couldn't have been worse. My father was being discharged, my family was still processing the mortgage revelation, and a potential crisis was unfolding with what could become our largest client yet. I was being pulled in opposite directions, forced to choose between family obligation and business responsibility. This was the challenge I hadn't anticipated when I purchased my parents' mortgage. How to balance the personal redemption I sought with the professional success I had built. The path forward wasn't clear, and for all my careful planning, I found myself facing a decision for which I was entirely unprepared. Standing in the hospital corridor outside my father's room, I stared at Ellie's text message. The Mid-South Bank. Security breach represented exactly the type of high-profile implementation that could cement Horizon Solutions' reputation in the financial sector. Their regional network included over 50 branches across 3 states. It would be our largest client by far. But my father was being discharged tomorrow. My mother was exhausted from days of hospital vigilance, and I had just revealed myself as the mysterious benefactor who had saved their home. Walking away now felt impossible. I stepped farther down the hallway and called Ellie. "How bad is the breach?" I asked without a preamble. "Bad," she confirmed. "They've detected unauthorized access to their customer database, including account numbers and transaction histories. Their current security team has contained it temporarily, but they need a comprehensive solution immediately. And they specifically asked for us? Their CIO attended your keynote at the security conference last month. He called Richard directly when their systems were compromised." I could hear the excitement in her voice beneath the professional tone. "Alex, this is the kind of scenario our platform was specifically designed to address. It's the perfect showcase for our capabilities." She was right. Mid-South situation was exactly what we had built Horizon Solutions to handle, but the timing couldn't have been worse. "I need 24 hours, I decided. My father's being discharged tomorrow. Once he's settled at home, I'll fly back." Ellie was silent for a moment. "Are you sure that's wise? Their executive team wants to meet first thing tomorrow morning." "Then you'll have to handle the initial meeting," I told her. "You know the platform better than anyone. Get them started with the emergency protocols, and I'll join remotely for the technical discussion." "Alex." Ellie's voice softened. "I know your family situation is complicated right now, but this is a pivotal moment for Horizon. We've worked for years for this kind of opportunity." The familiar tension twisted inside me. The need to prove myself professionally battling against personal obligations I'd neglected for too long. "I understand that," I said carefully. "But I also can't leave things unresolved here. Not now." After some discussion, we developed a compromise. Ellie would lead the initial client meeting with our technical director, implementing emergency security measures immediately. I would participate virtually for the strategic portions, then fly back to Boston the following evening after my father was settled at home. It wasn't ideal for anyone, but it was the best solution available. When I returned to my father's room, my mother was gathering his personal items while a nurse reviewed discharge instructions. Catherine sat nearby, taking notes on medication schedules and follow-up appointments. The scene was so ordinary, so domestic, that it was hard to reconcile with the extraordinary financial intervention I had just revealed to my father. "Everything okay?" my mother asked, noticing my expression. "Just some work issues," I replied vaguely. "Nothing that can't be handled." My father looked up from the paperwork he was signing. "Something with your company?" "A potential new client with an urgent situation," I explained, surprised by his interest. "Nothing for you to worry about." He studied me for a moment. "You know, I'd like to understand more about what you do. The security platform you've developed, how exactly does it work?" The question caught me off guard. In all our years of strained conversation, my father had never shown genuine curiosity about my work. Usually, any mention of my computer things was quickly redirected to Michael's latest promotion or Catherine's medical practice. "It's a predictive security system," I began cautiously. "Most cybersecurity measures are reactive. They respond after a breach has been detected. Horizon's platform uses behavioral analytics and machine learning to identify potential intrusions before they succeed." To my surprise, my father listened intently as I explained the basic concept, even asking follow-up questions about implementation timelines and client onboarding procedures. It was the most normal, professional conversation we'd ever had. "Sounds like you've created something valuable," he said finally. "Something that solves a real problem." Coming from William Harrington, this qualified as effusive praise. I felt an unexpected warmth spread through me. The simple satisfaction of professional recognition from the man whose approval I had sought for decades. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." Later that evening, after helping settle my father in at home, I set up a temporary workstation in my old bedroom. The space felt surreally unchanged. My high school academic certificates still framed on the wall, programming books still lined up on the shelf, the desk where I'd spent countless hours, coding now supporting my laptop as I prepared for tomorrow's virtual client meeting. A soft knock interrupted my preparation. Catherine stood in the doorway, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "Thought you could use this," she said, offering me one. "Mom said you've been working nonstop since you stepped away to take that call." "Thanks," I said, gratefully accepting the tea. "Big potential client. Their timing is less than ideal, but business doesn't wait for family crises," she finished, settling into the old reading chair in the corner. "I get it. My patients don't stop having emergencies because I have personal matters to attend to." We sat in companionable silence for a moment. Of all my family members, Catherine had always been the most supportive of my unconventional path, even if she didn't fully understand it. "So?" she said finally. "You bought our parents' mortgage and forgave the debt. That's quite a power move, little brother." I winced at her framing. It wasn't meant as a power move. "No?" She raised an eyebrow. "You became their anonymous creditor, held their financial fate in your hands, and then magnanimously forgave the debt after Dad had a heart attack. How would you describe it?" Put that way, my actions sounded calculating and theatrical. I struggled to articulate the complex motivations that had driven me. "I wanted to help them," I said finally. "But I also wanted recognition, I guess. Acknowledging that I wasn't the failure Dad always seemed to think I was." Catherine nodded slowly. "I understand that better than you might think. We've all spent our lives seeking Dad's approval, just in different ways. You?" I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. "But you were always the golden child. Valedictorian, Johns Hopkins Medical School, prestigious practice. And every achievement came with the expectation of the next one," she said quietly. "Nothing was ever quite enough. Do you know what Dad said when I made partner at the practice? Now, you should focus on opening your own clinic. Always moving the goalposts." I had never considered that my high-achieving siblings might feel the same pressure, the same constant striving for an approval that remained perpetually just out of reach. "Why didn't we ever talk about this?" I asked. All these years, I thought, I was the only one who couldn't measure up. Catherine smiled sadly. "The Harrington family specializes in silence and competition, not communication. Dad created an environment where we were all competing for his approval rather than supporting each other." She took a sip of her tea. "It's one of the reasons I've been in therapy for the past 3 years. This revelation stunned me. Perfect. Accomplished Catherine. In therapy to deal with the same paternal expectations that had driven me away. Does Dad know?" "God, no," she laughed. "Can you imagine? William Harrington doesn't believe in therapy. Harringtons handle their problems privately." She mimicked our father's authoritative tone perfectly. "Well, privately purchasing and forgiving a mortgage isn't exactly conventional therapy," I admitted with a rueful smile. "No, but it was effective," Catherine conceded. "You should have seen Mom's face when she got the confirmation that the house was paid off, like a 20-year weight had been lifted. The image brought me some comfort. Whatever my complicated feelings toward my father, my mother had always been a gentle presence caught in the crossfire of stronger personalities. The thought of her freedom from financial anxiety made the entire intervention worthwhile." "And Dad?" I asked. Beyond the initial shock, how was he really taking it? Catherine considered the question. "It's hard to tell. You know how he is. Emotions aren't his strong suit. But I overheard him telling Mom that he had severely misjudged you." She smiled. "Coming from Dad, that's practically a tearful apology while beating his chest in remorse." We both laughed, the tension of the past days finally breaking. As our laughter subsided, Catherine's expression grew more serious. Alex, whatever your reasons for doing this, it was genuine kindness. Dad might never find the right words to express his gratitude, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. Not just for your business success, but for choosing forgiveness over resentment when you had all the power. Her words touched me deeply, perhaps because they addressed the internal conflict I had been struggling with, the gap between my stated intentions and the more complicated emotions that had driven my actions. "Thank you," I said simply. "Now," she said, standing and straightening her sweater, "get some rest. From what I overheard from your call, you have a big meeting tomorrow." After she left, I returned to my preparation for the Mid-South Bank meeting, but with a lighter heart. The conversation with Catherine had helped clarify something important. While my purchase of the mortgage had begun partly as a power play, its resolution had become something healthier, a genuine act of familial support, however unconventionally expressed. The next morning, I participated virtually in the Mid-South Bank emergency meeting from my old bedroom. Ellie led brilliantly, walking their executive team through our platform's capabilities, while our technical director demonstrated how quickly we could implement protection for their most vulnerable systems. I joined for the strategic discussion, outlining a 3-phase implementation plan that would secure their customer data immediately, while building toward comprehensive protection. By meeting's end, we had a verbal commitment for a $1.2 million annual contract, by far our largest to date. The Mid-South CIO wanted our team on site beginning tomorrow to start emergency implementation. As I closed my laptop, I felt the familiar surge of professional satisfaction, but it was tempered by awareness of the ongoing family situation downstairs. My father was settled in the living room recliner, following doctor's orders to rest while recovering. My flight back to Boston was scheduled for 6 p.m., leaving just a few hours to address the still unsettled dynamics between us. I found him alone, reading the newspaper with the television muted in the background. He looked up as I entered, carefully, folding the paper and setting it aside. "Successful meeting?" he asked. "Very," I confirmed. "We landed Mid-South Bank as a client. It's a significant contract for us." "Congratulations," he said, with what appeared to be genuine pride. "Your mother mentioned you need to fly back this evening." I nodded, taking a seat across from him. "The client needs our team on site tomorrow. I'll coordinate the implementation from Boston." An awkward silence settled between us. Despite the emotional revelations of the past few days, we still lacked a comfortable language for genuine conversation. "Before you go," my father said finally, "there's something I need to say." He shifted in his recliner, wincing slightly at the movement. "What you did for us, paying off the mortgage, I'm still processing it. It's not easy for me to accept. That kind of help, especially from your disappointment of a son?" I finished when he trailed off. He flinched. "I deserve that." But what I was going to say was, especially from someone I've treated so poorly for so long. The admission hung in the air between us. My father had never acknowledged his treatment of me so directly. "I made so many mistakes with you, Alex," he continued. "I tried to force you into a mold that didn't fit, and when you resisted, I interpreted it as defiance rather than independence. I couldn't see that your path was just as valid as the ones your siblings chose." I sat in stunned silence. This level of self-awareness was unprecedented from my father. "The heart attack has given me a lot to think about," he went on. "The doctor says stress was a major factor, but it wasn't just the financial situation. It was the weight of all my perceived failures, at work, with our finances, and especially with you. Dad, you don't have to—" He held up a hand to stop me. "Please, let me finish. This isn't easy for me." He took a deep breath. "When you walked out after I called you a burden, something changed. For the first time, I saw genuine disappointment in your eyes. Not anger, not defiance, but as if you had finally given up on me as a father. It haunted me, even before the financial situation deteriorated further. I remembered that moment clearly, the calm that had come over me as I realized I would never earn this man's approval, and the liberation that came with that acceptance. Then we received the letter about Harrington Holdings, he continued. The name seemed like some cosmic joke. This unknown entity holding power over the home that represented everything I thought I had achieved. He shook his head slowly. And now to discover it was you all along. The irony isn't lost on me, Alex. That wasn't my intent, I said, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. Wasn't it? His gaze was direct, but not accusatory. At least part of you must have enjoyed the reversal, the burden becoming the savior. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Maybe, I admitted. At first, but that changed when I heard about your heart attack. I never wanted to cause you harm, Dad. Despite everything, you're still my father. He nodded slowly. And you're still my son. A son who has proven himself in ways I never imagined, while I proved myself a poorer father than I ever feared I might be. The vulnerability in his voice, so unfamiliar from this typically stoic man, moved me deeply. For the first time, I was seeing my father not as the intimidating figure of my childhood, but as a flawed human being facing his own failures and regrets. Where do we go from here? I asked quietly. I don't know, he admitted. I can't undo decades of misunderstanding in a single conversation, but I'd like to try for something better if you're willing. He hesitated. I'd like to understand your work, your life in Boston. Perhaps when I'm stronger, your mother and I could visit, see this company you've built. It was such a simple request, yet it represented a seismic shift in our relationship. My father, who had dismissed my career choice for years, was now asking to be included in that part of my life. I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. As I prepared to leave for the airport later that afternoon, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen. Whatever you and your father discussed earlier, thank you, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I haven't seen him this unburdened in years, despite everything he's going through physically. We just talked, Mom. Nothing dramatic. She smiled knowingly. Sometimes talking is the most dramatic thing two stubborn Harrington men can do. She pressed a small package into my hands. This is from your father. He asked me to give it to you before you left. Puzzled, I unwrapped the package in the privacy of my old room. Inside was a worn leather case. Opening it revealed my grandfather's pocket watch, a family heirloom I had admired throughout my childhood, with its intricate engraving and mechanical precision. Attached was a note in my father's distinctive handwriting. Alex, this belonged to your grandfather who recognized your potential long before I did. He wanted you to have it, and now I understand why. It represents the legacy of innovation and independent thinking that you've carried forward in ways I failed to appreciate. With respect and gratitude, Dad. I stood frozen, the watch heavy in my palm. This timepiece had been my father's most treasured possession, a connection to his own father that he had guarded jealously. Its transfer to me represented not just an acknowledgement of my place in the family legacy, but a profound shift in how my father perceived me. As I carefully packed the watch in my carry-on bag, I realized that the mortgage forgiveness, my grand gesture of both generosity and vindication, had ultimately mattered less than this simple act of recognition. The power to forgive financial debt paled in comparison to the power of forgiveness between father and son. With this understanding came a new clarity about the path forward, not just for my relationship with my family, but for the future of Horizon Solutions as well. The Mid-South contract represented an inflection point, a moment when our company would either scale successfully to meet growing demand or falter under the pressure of rapid expansion. Navigating this critical business juncture while rebuilding my family relationships would require careful planning and difficult choices. As my flight took off from Hartford, carrying me back to Boston and the waiting Mid-South crisis, I began formulating a comprehensive strategy that would address both the personal and professional challenges ahead. The burden my father had once perceived had truly transformed into something else entirely. Not just a successful entrepreneur, but a son capable of forgiveness, a brother reconnected to his siblings, and a businessman on the verge of taking his company to the next level. The question now was how to balance these roles without sacrificing any of them in the process. The scene at Mid-South Bank's headquarters in Nashville was controlled chaos when I arrived directly from the airport the next morning. Security personnel guarded every entrance, IT staff hurried through corridors with determined expressions, and worried executives huddled in glass-walled conference rooms. A data breach of this magnitude represented an existential threat to a regional bank. Customer trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. Ellie met me in the lobby, her usual composed demeanor tinged with excitement. "You're just in time. Their board is assembling for an emergency session in 20 minutes. They want us to present our implementation plan directly." As we walked through the security checkpoints, she briefed me on what our team had already accomplished in the 18 hours since the initial meeting. Our technical director, Ryan, had isolated the most critical vulnerabilities and applied emergency patches. Our security analyst, Sophia, had traced the breach to its origin point, a sophisticated phishing attack, targeting the bank's loan officers. The good news is the hackers only accessed the customer database for approximately 40 minutes before being detected, Ellie explained as we rode the elevator to the executive floor. The bad news is they were able to download account details for roughly 8,000 customers. "Has the bank notified affected customers?" I asked, mentally revising the presentation I'd prepared on the flight. "They're drafting communications now, but want our security protocols in place before making public announcements." The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area leading to Mid-South's boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see 15 people seated around a massive oak table, their expressions grim. The bank's CEO, James Donovan, stood at the head of the table reviewing documents with his CFO. "Ready for this?" Ellie asked quietly. I nodded, feeling the familiar surge of focused energy that came with high-stakes presentations. After the emotional intensity of the past few days with my family, the clarity of a technical challenge was almost a relief. James Donovan met us at the boardroom door, his handshake firm despite the strain evident in his expression. "Mr. Harrington, Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for responding so quickly to our situation." "Of course," I replied. "Your customers' security is now our top priority." As introductions were made around the table, I assessed the dynamics at play. The board members ranged from tech-savvy younger executives who understood the severity of the breach to older bankers who seemed more concerned with public relations than technical details. We would need to address both perspectives to gain unanimous support for our implementation plan. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began once everyone was seated, "Mid-South Bank is facing a critical security situation, but not an insurmountable one. With your permission, I'd like to outline exactly what's happened, what immediate steps we've already taken, and our 3-phase plan to protect your customers and restore security integrity." For the next 40 minutes, Ellie and I presented our comprehensive approach. I focused on the strategic overview and business implications, while she handled the technical architecture questions. We emphasized both immediate protection measures and long-term security infrastructure, not just patching the current vulnerability, but building a proactive system that would detect and neutralize threats before they became breaches. "What makes your platform different from our existing security measures?" asked an older board member, his tone skeptical. "We've already invested millions in cybersecurity. Traditional security is reactive," I explained. "It identifies threats based on known attack signatures. Horizon's platform is predictive. It analyzes behavioral patterns to identify suspicious activities before they become successful attacks." Like the difference between having security guards who respond after a bank robbery versus a system that notices someone casing the bank beforehand, Ellie added, translating the technical concept into terms the banking executives could immediately grasp. The room's energy shifted as understanding spread across the board members' faces. The CFO leaned forward, suddenly engaged. And the implementation timeline? How quickly can you have this fully operational? Phase 1. Emergency protection of customer data and account systems is already underway, I said. Phase 2. Comprehensive implementation across all bank operations will take approximately 3 weeks. Phase 3. Integration with your mobile and partner systems will require an additional 4 weeks. James Donovan exchanged glances with his executive team. 7 weeks for complete implementation? Our previous security upgrades took nearly 6 months. We've designed our platform for rapid deployment, I confirmed. Our team will work on site throughout the process, with dedicated specialists for each aspect of your operations. The questions continued, growing increasingly detailed as the board's initial skepticism transformed into cautious optimism. By the time we concluded our presentation, the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as an emergency damage control session had become a forward-looking strategic discussion. Mr. Harrington, Ms. Rodriguez, the CEO said finally, I think I speak for the entire board when I say we're impressed with your approach. Our legal team will review the contract immediately, but consider this a verbal commitment. We want Horizon Solutions implementing protection for our customers starting today. As handshakes were exchanged and final details discussed, I felt a profound satisfaction that went beyond landing a major client. We had created something that solved a real problem, that protected people's financial security in tangible ways. For the first time, I found myself wishing my father could see me in this professional context, not to prove my worth, but to share something I was genuinely proud of. The thought surprised me. After years of trying to escape my father's judgment, was I now seeking his witness instead? The next 3 weeks were among the most intense of my professional life. Implementing Horizon's platform across Mid-South's operations required our entire team working in coordinated shifts. Ellie led the technical integration while I managed client communications and adjusted our staffing to handle both this major implementation and our existing clients. The workload was enormous, but so was the opportunity. News of the Mid-South breach had reached industry publications, and our role in resolving it had attracted attention from other financial institutions. Suddenly, we were fielding inquiries from banks and credit unions across the country, all facing similar security concerns. Richard Whitman called 2 weeks into the Mid-South implementation. You've created quite a stir in the financial security sector, he said, his tone pleased. I've had calls from 3 other investment firms asking if Horizon is considering additional funding rounds for expansion. We hadn't planned on raising more capital until next year, I admitted. But with the current demand, we might need to accelerate that timeline. My advice? Strike while the iron is hot. The Mid-South situation has created a perfect market opportunity. Other banks are looking at them and thinking, that could be us next. Fear is a powerful motivator for investment in security. He was right, of course. The breach had created urgency around exactly the type of solution we offered. But rapid expansion would require additional resources, more developers, expanded office space, enhanced support infrastructure. I'll discuss it with Ellie, I promised. We should have a decision about next steps by the end of the month. As I hung up, I realized that Horizon Solutions stood at a critical inflection point. The decisions we made in the coming weeks would determine our growth trajectory for years to come. The responsibility was daunting but exhilarating. Amid this professional whirlwind, I maintained regular contact with my family. My mother called every other day with updates on my father's recovery. Catherine texted occasionally with medical observations about his progress. Even Michael had reached out once, sending a brief email inquiring about Horizon's security capabilities for his investment firm, a small but significant acknowledgement of my professional expertise. Most surprising were the messages from my father himself. Initially awkward and formal, his emails gradually evolved into genuine inquiries about my business and life in Boston. He had begun reading industry articles about cybersecurity, occasionally sending links with questions about technical concepts. These attempts at connection, however halting, represented more interest than he had shown in my career in all the years prior. 3 weeks after returning to Boston, with the Mid-South implementation progressing smoothly, I received an unexpected call from my father. "Alex," he said, his voice stronger than when I'd left him recovering at home. "I hope I'm not interrupting your workday." "Not at all," I replied, signaling my assistant to hold my next meeting. "How are you feeling?" "Better each day. The cardiologist is pleased with my progress." He cleared his throat. "I've been following news about that bank security breach in Nashville. Mid-South Bank, I believe." "That's right," I confirmed, surprised by his awareness. "Your company is handling their security implementation, isn't it? I saw a mention in the Wall Street Journal's technology section. The fact that my father was not only following financial news but connecting it to my work represented a seismic shift in his attention. Yes, we're about 3 weeks into the implementation. It's our largest client to date." "That's impressive. Alex?" The genuine pride in his voice caught me off guard. "I've been doing some reading about cybersecurity, trying to understand your field better. It's more complex than I had appreciated." Coming from William Harrington, this was tantamount to admitting he had been completely wrong in his previous dismissal of my career. "Thank you," I said, unsure how else to respond to this unprecedented acknowledgement. "It's definitely a specialized field. Which is why I'm calling," he continued. "Your mother and I have been discussing a visit to Boston, once I'm cleared for travel. I'd like to see your company, understand what you've built." He paused. "If that's something you'd be open to, of course." The request left me momentarily speechless. After years of dismissing my work as a computer hobby, my father was now asking to visit my company. The role reversal was so complete it was almost disorienting. "I'd like that," I said finally, surprised by my own enthusiasm for the idea. "Once you're feeling stronger, we can arrange a visit. I'd be happy to show you and Mom around." "Excellent." He sounded genuinely pleased. "The doctor thinks another month of recovery should be sufficient before travel." Another pause. "There's something else, Alex. Something I've been considering since you revealed the mortgage situation." "What's that?" I asked, curious about his tone, determined yet uncertain. "I want to repay you," he said firmly. "Not the entire amount," he added quickly. "I understand that's not feasible given our current finances, but making monthly payments toward what you spent, it's important to me." I understood immediately what this was about. My father was a proud man for whom indebtedness, especially to his youngest child, whom he had dismissed as a burden, was profoundly uncomfortable. This wasn't really about the money. It was about restoring his sense of dignity. "Dad, that's not necessary," I began. "The mortgage forgiveness wasn't a loan. It was a gift." "I understand that," he replied, his voice firm. "But I need to contribute something. It's not about the full amount. It's about the principle." I considered what this meant to him. After a lifetime of being the provider, the authority figure, the financial center of the family, the complete reversal of our positions had likely been as humbling as it was relieving. "How about this?" I suggested. "Instead of repaying me, you could contribute to a college fund for Billy and any future grandchildren. An investment in the next generation of Harringtons." There was a long pause on the line. "That's a thoughtful alternative," he said finally. "It honors your generosity while allowing me to contribute meaningfully to the family's future." "Exactly," I confirmed, grateful he understood the compromise I was offering. "We can work out the details when you visit." After we hung up, I sat at my desk contemplating how dramatically our relationship had evolved in just a few short weeks. The mortgage forgiveness that had begun partly as an act of vindication had opened a door to something I had never anticipated. A genuine relationship with my father based on mutual respect, rather than perpetual disappointment. This personal breakthrough coincided with Horizon's accelerating success, creating a sense of alignment that had been missing throughout my adult life. The parts of myself that I had kept rigidly separated, the ambitious entrepreneur and the wounded son seeking approval, were beginning to integrate into something more whole. With this newfound clarity came an important decision about Horizon's future. After extensive discussions with Ellie and our leadership team, we determined that the post-Mid-South demand necessitated a significant expansion. We would pursue an additional funding round to scale our operations, potentially tripling our valuation in the process. The evening after finalizing this decision, Ellie and I stayed late at the office, planning the details of our expansion strategy. The rest of our team had gone home hours earlier, leaving us alone with takeout containers and financial projections spread across the conference room table. "You seem different lately," Ellie observed, pushing aside her laptop. "More centered. Somehow." I considered her observation. "I think forgiving the mortgage changed more than just my parents' financial situation. It changed something fundamental in me." "How so?" "For years, I was driven by this need to prove my father wrong, to show him I wasn't the burden he thought I was. It fueled a lot of my ambition, but it also kept me tethered to his judgment." I gestured to the expansion plans before us. "Now, I'm making decisions based on what I believe is right for our company, our team, our clients, not as a reaction to my father's opinion of me." Ellie smiled. "Freedom looks good on you, Alex Harrington." "It feels good," I admitted. "Though I have to acknowledge some irony here. After years of seeking independence from my father's approval, I'm actually looking forward to showing him what we've built." "That's not irony, it's growth," Ellie countered. "Wanting to share your success with your father because you're proud of it, not because you need his validation. That's a fundamental difference." Her insight struck me as profoundly true. The shift wasn't just in my father's perception of me, but in my own relationship to his approval. I no longer needed it to feel successful, which paradoxically made me want to share that success with him. The following morning, our team gathered for a company-wide announcement about the expansion plans. Standing before our 30 employees, I felt a surge of pride in what we had collectively built. 3 years ago, Horizon Solutions existed only as code on our laptops and a vision for better security, I began. Today, we're protecting millions of financial transactions, safeguarding personal data for thousands of customers, and setting new standards for predictive security implementation. I outlined our expansion strategy, adding 15 new positions immediately, securing larger office space in Cambridge's tech corridor, establishing a dedicated client support division, and accelerating our platform development roadmap. This growth isn't just about becoming bigger, I emphasized. It's about fulfilling the promise of what we've created, extending protection to more clients, developing more sophisticated security protocols, and building a company that embodies both technical excellence and human-centered values. As I concluded the announcement, watching the excited reactions of our team, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From the painful rejection in my parents' kitchen to the mortgage forgiveness that had transformed both my family relationships and my own sense of purpose, each step had contributed to this moment of clarity and determination. The company stood at the threshold of significant expansion, and I stood at the threshold of a more integrated life, one where professional achievement and personal healing reinforced rather than competed with each other. The path forward wasn't without challenges, but for perhaps the first time, I was approaching those challenges from a place of wholeness rather than wound. The burden my father had once perceived had not only saved their home, but had evolved into a force for security and protection far beyond our family. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was the profound lesson it contained about the power of transmuting rejection into purpose and resentment into creative action. The weeks following, our expansion announcement transformed Horizon Solutions in ways both expected and surprising. Our recruitment efforts attracted top-tier talent from competing security firms, drawn by our growing reputation in the financial sector. The Mid-South implementation was completed ahead of schedule, earning us a glowing testimonial from their CEO that opened doors to 3 other regional banks. Richard Whitman had been right. Fear of similar breaches was driving financial institutions toward proactive security solutions. We leased 3 floors in a newly renovated building in Cambridge's tech corridor, tripling our office space. The modern glass and steel structure stood in stark contrast to our previous cramped quarters, a physical manifestation of our company's evolution from scrappy startup to established security provider. While Ellie oversaw the technical aspects of our expansion, I focused on strategic partnerships and investor relations. Richard had helped arrange meetings with 5 potential investment groups interested in our Series B funding round. The preliminary valuations exceeded even our optimistic projections. Horizon Solutions was now valued at approximately $42 million, with investment offers that would maintain our controlling interest while providing capital for aggressive expansion. Our rapid growth attracted media attention beyond industry publications. The Boston Globe ran a feature on the rising stars of New England tech, prominently featuring Horizon. TechCrunch published an analysis of our security approach, calling it potentially transformative for mid-sized financial institutions. Most surprisingly, the Wall Street Journal included a profile of our company in their weekend business section, focusing on how the Mid-South implementation had changed industry perceptions of cybersecurity requirements. I saved a copy of each article, partly for our company archives but also with the thought of showing them to my father during his upcoming visit. This impulse surprised me. After years of dismissing his opinion, I now found myself looking forward to sharing our success with him. The difference, as Ellie had observed, was that I no longer needed his approval to validate what we had built. Amid this professional whirlwind, preparations for my parents' visit took on unexpected significance. They would be arriving in 3 weeks, staying at the Marriott near our new offices. My father had been cleared for travel by his cardiologist, though still with restrictions on exertion and stress. My mother had been sending increasingly excited emails about seeing Boston through your eyes, Alex. The prospect of hosting my parents, particularly my father, in my professional domain created a curious mixture of anticipation and lingering apprehension. Our relationship had improved dramatically through our recent communications, but this would be our first face-to-face meeting since his hospitalization. Old patterns don't disappear overnight, regardless of newfound understanding. 2 weeks before their scheduled visit, I received a call from Catherine. "Just checking in before the big parental descent?" she began with characteristic directness. "How are you feeling about it?" "Surprisingly good," I admitted. There's still some awkwardness in our conversations, but nothing like before. Dad's been asking thoughtful questions about the business, actually doing research on cybersecurity. It's disorienting but nice. Mom says he's reading technical articles at breakfast, Catherine confirmed with amusement. Apparently, he tried to explain machine learning to her yesterday. We shared a laugh at the image of our father, who had once dismissed all technology beyond basic spreadsheets as computer nonsense, now attempting to understand artificial intelligence. "It's more than just intellectual curiosity," Catherine added, her tone growing more serious. "I visited last weekend, and he's different, Alex. More reflective, less rigid. The heart attack was terrifying, but it seems to have created a kind of opening in him." "Near-death experiences have a way of shifting perspectives," I acknowledged. But I think the mortgage situation played a role too. Having his financial crisis resolved so unexpectedly, it challenged his whole self-concept. Absolutely. His identity was so wrapped up in being the provider, the successful one. When that collapsed, and then you stepped in, she paused. It forced a complete reevaluation. I wasn't trying to humiliate him, I said, still sensitive about how my actions might have been perceived. I know that. And, remarkably, I think he knows it too. He told me something interesting last weekend. He said that after the initial shock, he realized your intervention wasn't about putting him in his place. It was about doing what he had failed to do for you. What does that mean? Catherine's voice softened. He said you protected the family when he couldn't, that you put aside personal grievances to ensure Mom's security, despite everything that had happened. He called it the kind of integrity I should have taught him. Her words left me momentarily speechless. The notion that my father, who had spent decades judging my choices, now saw integrity in my actions was profoundly affecting. Anyway, Catherine continued after a moment, I just wanted you to know that this visit means a lot to him. He's nervous about it, actually. Worried about embarrassing himself by not understanding your work. He told you that? Not directly. But I overheard him practicing questions to ask about your company, like he's preparing for a business meeting. She laughed softly. Our father, rehearsing conversations with his youngest child. Times really have changed. After hanging up, I sat at my desk pondering this new information. The image of my father preparing questions, concerned about understanding, my professional world created a strange tenderness in me. The role reversal was complete. He was now the one seeking approval, worried about measuring up. With this insight came a new responsibility. If I truly wanted reconciliation rather than revenge, I needed to ensure his visit affirmed rather than diminished his dignity. The plans I had made for their Boston trip suddenly seemed insufficient, too focused on showcasing my success without considering his comfort. I called our office manager and revised the schedule for their visit. Instead of the full company tour on the first day, we would start with a private lunch in my office, where I could explain our business model without an audience. Rather than the technical demonstration I had planned, which might highlight his limited understanding, we would focus on the real-world impact of our security systems, protecting people's savings, securing financial futures, and preventing identity theft. Concepts that aligned with his values rather than challenging his technical knowledge. Most importantly, I arranged for him to meet with Richard Whitman, whose financial expertise my father would respect. Richard had agreed immediately when I called him. I'd be delighted to meet the man who raised such a talented entrepreneur, he said. Besides, I still remember how he cut our conversation short at that birthday party. I'd enjoy seeing his expression when he realizes who your primary investor is. The weekend before my parents' arrival, I found myself doing something unexpected, cleaning my apartment with the same nervous attention to detail my mother had always shown before my father's. Business associates came to dinner. I replaced the functional futon in my guest room with a proper bed, stocked the refrigerator with foods I remembered my parents enjoying, and even bought fresh flowers for the dining table, something I had never done for myself. Ellie noticed my unusual domesticity when she came over to review investor presentations on Sunday evening. Should I be concerned that you're channeling your mother? She asked, watching me adjust a vase of lilies for the third time. I laughed, recognizing the absurdity. I'm becoming everything I once mocked. Next, I'll be ironing napkins and alphabetizing the spice rack. It's sweet, she decided, settling on the couch with her laptop. You want them to feel welcome? I want them to see that I've built a real life here, I admitted. Not just a successful company, but a home. Stability. All the things my father values, just on my terms, not his. Ellie nodded thoughtfully. You know what's interesting? When we first met in college, you talked about your father constantly. usually about proving him wrong or escaping his influence. Now you're talking about showing him what you've created, sharing your world with him. That's a huge shift. Her observation hit home. The energy I had once poured into rebellion and resentment had transformed into something more constructive, building a life and career I was genuinely proud of, independent of my father's judgment, but not defined by opposition to it. I guess buying someone's mortgage and forgiving their debt changes the dynamic, I joked, though we both knew the transformation went deeper than financial transactions. The day of my parents' arrival brought unexpected nervousness. I found myself checking my phone repeatedly during morning meetings, tracking their flight from Hartford to Boston. When my assistant informed me their taxi had arrived downstairs, I straightened my tie in the reflection of my office window. A gesture so reminiscent of my father preparing to meet important clients that I had to smile at the irony. My mother entered first, her face lighting up when she saw me. Her embrace felt the same as always, warm, unconditional, slightly floral-scented. But my father's appearance behind her caught me off guard. William Harrington had always been a commanding, physical presence, tall, impeccably dressed, radiating authority. The man who walked somewhat hesitant into my office looked diminished, not just physically, but in bearing. His suit, while still well-tailored, hung slightly loose on his frame. His once dark hair had more silver than I remembered, and fine lines had deepened around his eyes. Yet when he extended his hand, his grip remained firm. "Alex," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. "Thank you for having us." "I'm glad you could come," I replied, surprised by the genuine warmth I felt. "Welcome to Horizon Solutions." My mother glanced between us, relief evident in her expression. Whatever she had feared might transpire in this first face-to-face meeting, since the confrontation clearly hadn't materialized. "Your office is wonderful," she enthused, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows. "What a view of Charles!" "Wait until you see the main workspace," I told her. "But first, I thought we'd have lunch here, just the three of us." Over the meal I had catered from a local bistro, I explained Horizon's business model in terms designed to be accessible, focusing on client needs and security outcomes rather than technical specifications. My father listened intently, asking surprisingly insightful questions about market positioning and competitive advantages. "You've created something with real staying power," he observed as we finished dessert. "Not just chasing technological trends, but addressing fundamental business concerns." The assessment, so aligned with how I viewed our company's mission, startled me with its accuracy. "That's exactly our approach," I confirmed. "Security isn't just about the latest technology. It's about understanding what people and businesses need to protect." He nodded, satisfied in his expression. "Your grandfather would appreciate that perspective. He always said innovation without practical application was just an interesting hobby." The invocation of Grandpa Arthur's wisdom, once used to dismiss my interests, now deployed as affirmation of my business approach, illustrated how dramatically our dynamic had shifted. After lunch, I gave them a tour of our new offices. My mother exclaimed over the modern design and amenities, while my father observed the operations with careful attention. When we reached the development floor, Ellie met us by the central workstations. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington," she greeted them, warmly. "It's wonderful to finally meet you." "You must be Ellie," my mother said, clasping her hand. "Alex has told us so much about your partnership. The technical genius behind Horizon, he calls you." Ellie smiled at me. "We complement each other's strengths. Alex sees market opportunities and client needs I might miss, while I handle the technical architecture." My father studied the busy development floor, where engineers worked at clustered workstations surrounded by multiple monitors displaying code and security analytics. "Impressive operation," he said. "How many people work here now?" 47, I answered, with 15 more starting next month after our funding round closes. A subtle shift occurred in his expression, respect mingled with something like wonder. This was the moment I had once imagined would bring vindication. My father confronted with irrefutable evidence of my success. Instead, I found myself wanting to ease any discomfort he might feel at the scale of what we had built without his support or understanding. "Would you like to see how the security platform actually works?" I offered. "Ellie's team has set up a demonstration that shows how we protect financial transactions in real time." As Ellie led us to the demonstration area, she quietly adjusted her presentation to make the technical concepts more accessible, a sensitivity I appreciated. My father followed attentively, asking questions that revealed both his limited technical knowledge and his genuine desire to understand. The most remarkable moment came during our meeting with Richard Whitman later that afternoon. Richard greeted my father with the polished ease of someone accustomed to navigating complex social situations. "Mr. Harrington, it is a pleasure to finally have a proper conversation," he said, shaking my father's hand firmly. "We met briefly at your grandson's birthday party, though we didn't have the opportunity to speak at length." Recognition flickered across my father's face. Embarrassment followed by a composed recovery. "Of course, Mr. Whitman, I apologize for the brevity of our previous interaction." "No apology necessary," Richard assured him. "Things worked out quite well in the end. Your son has built an extraordinary company, one that's attracting significant attention from the investment community." For the next 30 minutes, Richard outlined Horizon's growth trajectory and market positioning in the terms of a professional investor speaking to a financial peer. He treated my father with the same respect he would show any business associate, neither condescending to his limited technical understanding, nor emphasizing the contrast between his initial dismissal of my business and its current success. "The cybersecurity sector is projected to grow at 15% annually for the next decade," Richard concluded. "Horizon's specialized focus on financial institutions positions it exceptionally well within that expanding market." My father nodded thoughtfully. "You've clearly built something with remarkable potential," he said, addressing me directly. "The vision and execution are impressive." Coming from William Harrington, this constituted effusive praise. But more striking than his words was his expression, a complex mixture of pride, regret, and genuine admiration that I had never seen directed at me before. As we walked my parents back to their hotel that evening, my father was uncharacteristically quiet. My mother filled the silence with enthusiastic observations about the office, the team, the Boston architecture. Only when we reached the hotel lobby did my father speak again. "Alex," he said, his voice unusually hesitant, "would you have time for breakfast tomorrow, just the two of us? There are some things I'd like to discuss." The request, so direct, so unlike our previous carefully managed interactions, caught me by surprise. "Of course," I agreed. "I'll meet you here at 8:00. That night, as I prepared for bed, I found myself contemplating how completely circumstances had reversed since that confrontation in my parents' kitchen. I had gone from seeking a $50,000 loan to running a multi-million-dollar company. My father had gone from dismissing my computer hobby to requesting private conversations about my business. The mortgage that had represented his failure and my vindication had become, unexpectedly, the catalyst for genuine communication between us. What my father might want to discuss over breakfast remained unclear. But whatever it was, I would approach it not from the wounded place of the son who had been called a burden, but from the centered place of someone who had found his value, and who now had the capacity to offer his father the dignity of honest conversation without the weight of past resentments. The burden had truly been lifted, not just the financial one from my parents' shoulders, but the emotional one I had carried for so long, the need to prove my worth to someone who hadn't possessed the capacity to recognize it. Whatever tomorrow's conversation held, I would face it as the person I had become. Successful on my own terms, secure in my choices, and open to a relationship with my father that neither of us could have imagined just months ago. The hotel restaurant was quiet at 8 a.m., with just a few business travelers hunched over laptops and coffee cups. My father had arrived before me, already seated at a corner table with a view of the Boston skyline. He wore a light blue dress shirt, no tie, no jacket. Another, small but noticeable deviation from the formal business attire he had maintained throughout my childhood. "Good morning," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," he replied. "Your mother is still resting. She wants to explore Newbury Street later today." The server appeared to take our orders, and omelet for me, oatmeal for my father. "Doctor's orders," he explained with resignation. As she walked away, a silence settled between us, not quite uncomfortable, but weighted with anticipation. "Yesterday was illuminating," my father began finally. "Seeing your company, meeting your team. It's far more impressive than I had imagined." "Thank you," I said simply, accepting the compliment without the defensiveness that would have colored such an exchange in the past. He stirred his coffee methodically. "I keep thinking about that day in our kitchen when you asked for the loan. How dismissive I was. How wrong. I hadn't expected him to address the confrontation so directly." "A lot has changed since then," I offered. "Yes. But some things were true even then. Your vision for Horizon was sound. The security platform was viable. I just couldn't, or wouldn't, see it." He placed his spoon deliberately beside his cup. "I've been asking myself why. Why was I so blind to your potential for so long?" The question hung between us. In the past, I might have eagerly supplied answers. His rigidity, his narrow definition of success, his inability to value paths different from his own. Now I simply waited, allowing him the space to reach his own conclusions. "I've come to believe," he continued carefully, "that I was threatened by your independence, your willingness to chart your own course." A rueful smile briefly crossed his face. "You were immune to the things that drove your siblings and me. Conventional, success, social standing, external validation. I didn't understand that immunity, so I labeled it as immaturity or rebellion. This level of self-awareness from my father was unprecedented. It occurred to me that he must have been working through these realizations for weeks, perhaps with my mother's gentle guidance, or through his own difficult reflections during recovery. The heart attack changed things, he admitted, his gaze now fixed on the city skyline. Not just physically. When you're forced to confront your mortality, priorities shift. Regrets become more insistent. Our food arrived, creating a brief respite in the intensity of the conversation. I watched my father methodically prepare his oatmeal with measured portions of brown sugar and berries, the careful precision that had always characterized his approach to life. "One of my biggest regrets," he said after a few bites, "is not knowing you better. The real you, not the version I tried to shape you into." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I failed you as a father, Alex, not in providing education or opportunities, but in something more fundamental, seeing you clearly and valuing what I saw." The simple acknowledgement, unqualified without defensiveness, struck me more powerfully than I could have anticipated. For years, I had imagined confronting my father with evidence of his failures, forcing him to recognize how he had diminished me. But hearing him volunteer this recognition, without prompting or accusation, somehow meant more than any forced acknowledgement ever could. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, careful to keep my voice steady. "It hasn't been an easy road between us." "No," he agreed. "And that brings me to why I wanted to speak with you privately." He straightened slightly as if preparing to address a difficult business matter. "The mortgage situation. Your intervention was extraordinary, both in its generosity and in what it revealed about your character. I tensed slightly, unsure where he was heading. When I first learned it was you who had purchased and forgiven our debt, my initial reaction was humiliation, he admitted. The role reversal was difficult to process. But as I've reflected on it, I've come to see it differently. How so? I asked. You did what I should have done for you all those years. You offered support without judgment. You saw a need and met it, not to create obligation or assert control, but simply because you could. His voice grew softer. That's the kind of father I should have been. The simple honesty of his statement caught me unprepared. I had imagined many versions of this conversation: defensive justifications, grudging gratitude, even continued resentment. But not this humble recognition. Dad, I began, but he raised his hand slightly. Please let me finish. This isn't easy for me. He took a breath. I spoke with your grandfather often before his passing. He saw in you what I couldn't: an innovative mind, a different kind of intelligence. He told me once that you would surprise everyone someday. Alex sees patterns others miss, he said. I had never known about these conversations between my grandfather and father. The revelation that Grandpa Arthur had defended my potential even as my father dismissed it added another dimension to my understanding of our family dynamics. He was right, of course, my father continued, and I was wrong, spectacularly, persistently wrong. A faint smile touched his lips. Being wrong isn't something I've ever accepted gracefully. Ask your mother. This small moment of self-deprecating humor, so rare from my always serious father, lightened the atmosphere momentarily. So, where do we go from here? I asked, echoing the question I had posed during our hospital conversation, but now from a place of genuine curiosity rather than uncertainty. That's what I wanted to discuss. He straightened, his expression becoming more focused. I have a proposal. A business proposition, actually. This unexpected pivot intrigued me. I'm listening. Hartford Financial Services, my employer for the past 27 years, has fallen behind in cybersecurity implementation. Their systems are outdated, vulnerable. The executive committee recognizes the risk, but has been slow to address it comprehensively. I saw immediately where he was heading. You think they could benefit from Horizon's platform? He nodded. I've spoken informally with our CIO about your company's work with Mid-South Bank. There's significant interest, but also institutional inertia. They're used to working with established vendors, multinational security firms. And you think you could help navigate that inertia? I suggested, seeing his strategy forming. I know the internal politics, the decision-makers, the budget priorities, he confirmed. I could facilitate introductions, help position Horizon's solution in terms that would resonate with Hartford's leadership. The proposition was unexpected, but made perfect sense. My father's decades of experience at Hartford Financial gave him insights and relationships that could be invaluable in securing them as a client. It was a straightforward business arrangement that would benefit both Horizon and my father, allowing him to contribute meaningfully while maintaining his dignity. I think that could work, I said thoughtfully. We've been looking to expand in the insurance sector. Hartford would be an ideal flagship client in that vertical. You'd be open to it then? My involvement as a consultant of sorts? The slight hesitation in his voice revealed his uncertainty about how I would receive the offer. More than open, I assured him. It's a smart approach. You bring industry knowledge and relationships we'd struggle to develop organically. Relief visibly washed over him. I was concerned you might view it as intrusion, or an attempt to claim credit for your success. A year ago, I might have, I acknowledged candidly. But we're in a different place now. This is a legitimate business opportunity that makes sense for both parties. I smiled. And it gives us a structured way to continue rebuilding our relationship. My father's expression softened in a way I had rarely seen. That's what I was hoping for. a new foundation based on mutual respect and shared purpose. As we finished breakfast and discussed preliminary strategy for approaching Hartford Financial, I marveled at how thoroughly our dynamic had transformed. My father was now soliciting my approval, offering to work within parameters I would define, treating me as a business equal whose expertise he recognized. The reversal was so complete it might have felt vindicating, had vengeance still been my aim. But somewhere along this journey, perhaps when I purchased the mortgage, or during his health crisis, or in our hospital reconciliation, my objective had shifted from proving myself to my father to simply building something worthwhile, both professionally and personally. When we rejoined my mother later that morning, she immediately sensed the changed atmosphere between us. "Well, you two look pleased with yourselves," she observed as we met her in the hotel lobby. "Should I be concerned?" "Not at all," my father assured her, briefly explaining the potential Hartford Financial connection. "So now you'll be working together?" she asked, her expression a mixture of delight and disbelief. "In a limited capacity," I clarified. "Dad will help us understand Hartford's needs and decision-making process and make introductions to the right people. It's a starting point," my father added, with a meaningful glance at me that acknowledged this was about more than just business. The remainder of their visit unfolded with a warmth and ease I had never experienced with my parents before. My mother explored Boston's shopping districts while my father and I had several productive strategy sessions about Hartford Financial. I introduced them to Ellie's family over dinner, where my father engaged her in a lengthy conversation about the evolution of computer programming, a subject he would have dismissed as irrelevant just months earlier. We even spent a relaxed Sunday afternoon walking the Freedom Trail, behaving like a normal family enjoying a tourist attraction rather than navigating a minefield of expectations and disappointments. When it came time for their departure, my mother embraced me with tears in her eyes. "This has been wonderful, Alex, seeing your life here, your success." She lowered her voice. "And seeing you and your father finally connecting. It's what I've prayed for years." My father's goodbye was more reserved, but equally meaningful. He extended his hand formally, then surprised me by pulling me into a brief but firm embrace. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." As their taxi pulled away from the curb, I felt a sense of completion that had eluded me throughout my adult life. The mortgage that had once represented my father's failure and my vindication had become the catalyst for something neither of us could have anticipated, a genuine relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation or resentment. In the months that followed, this transformation extended beyond my relationship with my father. The Hartford Financial connection proved valuable, leading to a substantial contract that established Horizon Solutions in the insurance sector. My father approached his consultant role with characteristic thoroughness, providing insights that genuinely enhanced our implementation strategy. Our family dynamics shifted as well. Holiday gatherings, once tense affairs focused on my father's approval, became more balanced exchanges. Michael, seeing the changed relationship between our father and me, gradually lowered his own defensiveness. Catherine spoke more openly about her professional challenges, no longer feeling the need to present a perfect facade. The most profound change, however, was internal. The drive that had fueled me for so long, to prove my worth to a father who couldn't see it, had transformed into something healthier, building value on my own terms, guided by my own vision rather than reaction to his judgment. A year after my father's heart attack, we gathered at my parents' home to celebrate his full recovery and their 45th wedding anniversary. The house that had once nearly been lost to foreclosure was now fully theirs, its mortgage a closed chapter in our family history. During the celebration, my father asked me to join him in his study, the inner sanctum that had once represented his authority and distance. The room had changed subtly. Family photos now outnumbered the professional awards, including several of Horizon's team at industry events, and one of my father and me at the Hartford financial contract signing. "I wanted to show you something," he said, removing a frame from his desk drawer. It contained the certificate of mortgage satisfaction I had arranged, alongside a handwritten note. "The true measure of success is creating something that continues to serve its purpose long after you're gone." I recognized the words immediately. My grandfather's philosophy that I had adopted as Horizon's unofficial motto. "You probably don't remember," my father said quietly. But these were the last words my father said to me before he passed. I didn't understand them then. Thought he was referring to material legacy, financial security. He touched the frame, gently. Now I realize he meant something deeper. The legacy of relationships, of values transmitted not through lectures but through actions. He placed the frame on his desk, prominently displayed beside his cherished family photos. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Alex, not just for your professional success, but for the man you've become. Someone capable of forgiveness even when it wasn't deserved." Coming from my father, who had once dismissed my potential, called me a burden, and now acknowledged my character with genuine admiration, these words represented the completion of a circle I had never expected to close. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing he would understand the depth behind those two words. As we rejoined the anniversary celebration, I reflected on the strange, painful, ultimately healing journey that had brought us to this point. What had begun with rejection, nothing but a burden on this family, had transformed through a series of choices into something neither my father nor I could have imagined: mutual respect, genuine connection, and the recognition that true worth isn't measured in financial transactions or professional achievements, but in the capacity to grow beyond our wounds toward something more whole. The mortgage I had purchased and forgiven had indeed lifted a burden, not just the financial one from my parents' shoulders, but the emotional one I had carried for so long. In forgiving my father's debt, I had ultimately freed myself from the need for his validation, creating space for a relationship based not on the pain of the past, but on the possibilities of the present. That night, as the celebration wound down, I stepped onto the back porch of my childhood home and looked up at the stars, the same stars I had gazed at as a teenager, dreaming of escape and vindication. But now, standing in the yard where I had once felt like an outsider in my own family, I experienced something unexpected, a sense of belonging that came not from external validation, but from internal peace. The burden had truly been lifted, transformed into something neither my father nor I could have predicted, a foundation for authentic connection that honored both our differences and our shared humanity. The most powerful revelation wasn't that I had proved my father wrong, although I had. It wasn't even that I had saved the family home, although that mattered. The true transformation was in recognizing that forgiveness, of financial debt, of past hurts, of human limitations, had the power to liberate not just the forgiven, but the forgiver as well. In releasing my father from his monetary obligation, I had ultimately released myself from the heaviest burden of all, the need to measure my worth through someone else's eyes. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.